talk in the first quarter of our program on health, environment, disease, and world history. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Kim Bowes, who's Associate Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's previously held positions at Fordham and Cornell. She did a BA at Williams and a PhD at Princeton. She's a historian and archaeologist, to the extent that one can separate those two things, of the late antique Mediterranean. She's one of those rare people who moves effortlessly between the study of text and the work on material culture. This is reflected in a wide range of publications. She's the author or co-author of 4 books, including Private Worship, Public Values, and Religious Change in Late Antiquity, and most recently, Houses and Society in the Later Roman Empire, came out in 2010. And she's currently engaged in archaeological work on a series of sites in rural Italy. Her paper today that she's going to be discussing, rural poverty in the Roman Empire, is drawn from this work. And commentating will be Nathan the Venerable, the Honourable Nathan Rosenstein, historian of the Roman Republic and early empire, product of UC Berkeley, and he has co-written or co-edited numerous books, including most recently, I think, Rome at War, Farms, Families, and Death in the Middle Republic. And he's also got a long-standing interest in Roman demographic and agrarian issues. So Nathan will be providing commentary. So off you go, Kate.
Okay. Thank you particularly to Chris and John for inviting me, and thank all of you guys for coming. I know this is the end of your term, so you should more profitably be in a bar. But I hope that you can go there soon. I've been told that I cannot talk for more than 20 minutes. It's very difficult for an archaeologist because I feel as though you need to see lots and lots of pictures. So I'm going to try to keep myself to that time. First I must draw your attention to our sponsors, the various people who supported this project over its 3-year run and its next 3-year run, particularly the National Science Foundation, and students at Penn and Cornell who lent their backs and blood and sweat to this project. I understand, John and Chris assure me that you guys have all read the paper that I circulated, which was unconscionably long, for which I apologize, and I will provide a very brief summary of that, particularly focusing on the results of my project rather than the historiography. So this slide in some ways is maybe not necessary for this group of people. It's always necessary when I talk to classical archaeologists. Why should you care about Roman peasants or the rural poor? And I use the term peasants, fully aware of the baggage that it carries, much of which is rooted in a European medieval historiography. On the other hand, I think a number of people have used it more recently profitably, somewhat free of that baggage, and so I choose to use it here simply to mean rural people who worked the land. So I use, as I said in my paper, a very deliberately broad definition of the peasantry. Why should we care about these people? Nate will give you more detail on this, but the best demographic estimates that we have for the ancient world suggest that this is 90% of the population, maybe 80% in Italy. What we know about that 90% in Roman history and archaeology is extraordinarily little. So for those of you who work on periods with better documentation, you would be appalled at the question marks that dot the literature. What did Roman poor people eat? How much did they make in wages? Were wages a significant portion of their subsistence? How did they grow crops? The most basic things we are utterly ignorant on. And I would argue that rather than this image of, I don't have this here. I've given you an image, the best image I could come up with for many people's idea of what Roman life was like, which involved reclining half-naked, drinking large quantities of booze and eating dormice dipped in honey. This is 10% of the population, and that Roman quality of life and Roman well-being is represented by this deliberately very small image of the rural peasantry, about which we know very little. This is why I think we should care. And it was this very basic idea that motivated our project. The status quo, if I can very briefly summarize it and characterize it in a way, is that probable high population pressure, particularly by the late Republic and the early Empire, produced Malthusian conditions in which there was a lot of pressure on land, wages were low, the periodic drought cycles of the Mediterranean produced periodic food shortages, borderline subsistence farming, which was always difficult, became even more difficult because of these pressures. Poor diet based largely on carbohydrates and therefore subject to malnutrition, combined with all of these to produce, if not frequent famine, at least certain amounts of food shortages. These stressed out people are thought in general to have very limited contact with external markets. And the economic historians who've grown dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years, who've been interested in the so-called Roman economic miracle or Roman economic growth, have, if they've bothered to consider the 90% of the population that were the rural poor, have more or less tended to assume that they didn't participate in this increasingly strong economic engine. And so, broadly speaking, the consensus is represented in a radical way by an article I circulated by William Harris that really describes the life of the Roman peasant as being, as one person said, not dissimilar from the previous prime minister of Italy, nasty, brutish, and short. These are models which I think interestingly have largely been produced by historians. And as I tried to gesture in my paper, and for those of you who work on the ancient world know, the source basis for the rural poor in the ancient world is extremely small and incredibly problematic. Because these are sources that are almost entirely written by elites for elites. And so the fact that historians, textual historians, should have dominated this discourse, as an archaeologist, I found embarrassing. And so it was this fact, another factor that helped us to develop this project. Archaeology's contribution to the question of the Roman peasantry has largely been through field survey, and I was discussing this with some of the graduate students at lunch today. Field survey, for those of you who don't do this, involves walking in straight lines and picking up pots. It is, and this is just an image of one of the most famous early field surveys done in Italy, the Southern Etruria survey. And it tends to be very good at figuring out when people lived and where they lived. It doesn't tend to produce very much data on who they were or how they lived. And so what is tended to be the case is that field survey produces lots of very, very small sites that that have very poor material culture, that is to say cooking pots, a few fragments of roof tiles, things of this nature, and it has been assumed that these smallest surface scatters, as they're called, represent the houses of the rural poor. And so what people have done with that information is, because it's essentially spatial information and chronological information, they've used it to interrogate the relationship between small sites and big sites, that is to say, between rural poor people, whoever they may be, and larger landowners. The narrative that's been particularly dominant in this field is the growth of slave agriculture in the late Republic and early Empire, and the assumed concomitant decline of the small free farmer. This is now a highly contested narrative, but it still remains the question that has dominated in many ways the field, and it's the question that archaeology has been used most in contribution. This is because there's been very, very little excavation of these sites. In other words, what we have is field survey. We have very few excavated sites, which means we have very little data on the things that this group would probably like to know about. Diet, mortality, morbidity, even things like land use and agricultural practices. This is the kind of data that one would hope to get from actual excavation. So the aims of our project began actually, I presented them in this paper in response and in dialogue to the set of historiographic models. But our project actually began with far more simple aims. It was simply, first of all, an attempt to prove that archaeology could actually contribute something to the study of the rural poor beyond what had been done in field survey. Secondarily, it was designed to test some of the current historiographic models about rural poverty. It was also designed to work with a rural community, a modern rural community. The way in which we've tried to accomplish this is to dig a little bit differently than those of you who may have some familiarity with archaeology. We dig very fast and we dig multiple sites. And this is something that I talked about with the graduate students in lunch, and I'm happy to elaborate on in the discussion section. The point of this is to produce multiple data sets, which, without sacrificing very much in terms of the thickness of that data. The presumption behind this is that there's probably huge amounts of heterogeneity in what we're calling the rural poor, and if we only excavate a few sites, we won't be able to see that. So that means that we have to dig quick and we have to dig lots of sites. We are hoping in doing this to actually be able to peer beyond the models a bit to other kinds of issues. Ultimately, I list land use, diet, and architecture here. Other sorts of issues that we'd like to be able to understand is how these people perceive their landscapes, how they move around their landscapes, things of this nature. Working with a modern community, it's been our intention that this is not information that is necessarily only of interest to a scholarly community. These people are, if not the direct descendants of ancient rural dwellers, they certainly carry on many of their practices, and this is their community. So we are doing a project working with school children to try to teach them not simply about sort of Roman agriculture, but why archaeology is important and how archaeology contributes to the modern world. I'll just summarize what I think are the most important results that we've had so far. And I talked about these in more detail in my paper. The most important, I think, is the question of where Roman peasants lived. And this may not, at the surface, seem to pertain much to what this group is interested in, but I think the knock-on effects, the implications are enormous. We've dug now 6 of the smallest, and the range of smallest is large, deliberately, surface scatters. And we've only found 1 or maybe 2 sites that we can actually reasonably identify as peasant habitations, the places where people actually lived. Sorry about that. It's supposed to make them. This is the one secure example that we have. This is the site of Piadina. This is the late antique phase of this site. It also had a Roman phase that was larger and more elaborate. The late antique phase, however, is where we really could see what we think is a peasant house. It's a very small 4 meter by 4 meter structure with an extension made of posts, which we hypothesized was used for animals. It's surrounded by drains. It has a hearth and produced really sizable quantities of so-called consumer good. Lots of ceramics, lots of faunal material, and lots of coins. The other sites that we've excavated, we can't really, many of them are some of them are absolutely not habitations, and the others are probably not habitations. We have a whole range of sites that we found, ranging from field drains to sites that seem to be used for seasonal work activities, and agro-industrial processing sites. So the implications, I think, of actually that all the dots on this map don't equal people is potentially important. So the first set of implications are obviously demographic. For those people who have wanted to use field survey to try to reconstruct ancient demographics, at the very least, this casts serious doubt on this enterprise, I think, because we can no longer be sure that these small dots all equal people. Some of them, the majority of the dots in our survey, we think represent things like animal pens and seasonal use sites and agro-processing centers rather than permanent human settlements. It also suggests that there's an enormous variability rather than a monolithic poor peasant house. What we're actually finding is an enormous range and variability both in material wealth and function of these sites, many of which seem to be pretty highly specialized. This was also something that nobody, I think, had really anticipated. If peasants are not living in the places that we're digging, where are they living? I think the best hypothesis that we can think of anyway is that they commute. In other words, they live in villages and they commute out to these small sites. We haven't excavated one of these villages yet. That's on our task of things to do next year. The fact that many of these sites seem to have highly specialized uses points to a far more specialized and potentially intensive use of the landscape and a lot of mobility, moving around the landscape from site to site, both commuting from habitation sites to agricultural fields, but also commuting for a whole lot of other reasons, like to process your crops, or, as we found, and I'll describe in a second, collecting building stones. We have, I think, a certain amount of evidence at this point for intensive agriculture. This is something that in general, not in toto, but in general has been dismissed by historians of Roman agriculture as something that the smallest rural farmers engaged in. That is to say, real significant investment in terms of either agricultural tools, technology, or the modification of landscapes to improve productivity. This is something that was not thought to have been done. We have indirect evidence for this being done actually on a fairly significant scale in the form of really elaborate field drains. This is one that we found last year that's really large, and these are being built they're not being built in fields that they're going to be growing anything other than probably either grain or even pasture. In other words, they're not being put in places for cash crops, but they're seemingly being done as a matter of course to optimize hydrological conditions in fields. We also have a certain amount of evidence now from pollen data for legume fallowing. In other words, instead of leaving your fields completely empty for a year to allow them to recharge their nutrients, which is assumed to have been the case, this is a very inefficient use of land, we seem to have evidence for actual intercropping with legumes, and in this case probably lentils. So this is a far more efficient use of land, which increases productivity. We seem, at least, we have the one site that's a clear habitation. We have, I think, reasonably good evidence for lots of meat eating. Roman peasants are kind of widely assumed to not have eaten very much meat because it was too expensive, both to raise and or to purchase. We have, I think, shown that, at least in the case that we have good evidence for, that this is not the case. We also have among our faunal collections, I think, pretty clear evidence for cattle being used for traction. Many of the extreme models of the poverty of Roman peasants assume that they just hitched themselves to their plows and hauled them around, and this never made sense to me, and it didn't make sense to them either, because they seem to have used their cattle for traction. We have evidence for storage, a granary that we found from the late Republican period in the same site of Piadina, fairly large in capacity, far exceeding what would be required for storage for seed for the next year, or even storage for a bad year. In other words, it seems to be large enough to have stored grain for sale on the market. And as I've mentioned before, we have evidence for communal agro-processing of olive oil and wine. These are another two things that Roman peasants aren't supposed to have consumed very much of. Again, never made any sense to me. They are Italians. And they almost certainly seem to have been doing this in a collective setting, which is also interesting. All of this suggests, you can't see my red lettering very well down here, that the definition, standard definition of what counts as subsistence agriculture, I think, probably needs revision. We have pretty clear evidence for really quite tight connections with urban markets. And this is interesting data because it comes from a 5th century AD site. The 5th century is square in the middle of late antiquity when all sorts of terrible things are supposed to have happened, particularly the severing of city from countryside. The ceramic evidence we have from Piavina shows that the ceramics in this tiny, poor, really very small house are almost identical to those that are being used in the nearest city. So we were actually able to compare them directly. We also had, actually that 25 is a typo. That should be 45 plus low denomination coins. Another idea of Roman peasants is that they aren't supposed to have used money. They were supposed to have engaged in barter. At least in this case, in late antiquity, they are certainly using money. And these are all very low denomination coins. These aren't being used for large purchases, but for sort of day-to-day sorts of things. All of which suggests contact with the Roman market economy, and potentially a fairly tight linkage with this Roman growth economy that economic historians have been so interested in. And then finally, we found lots of secondary indicators for mobility, for people moving around the landscape for a variety of things. I've already talked about commuting peasants and specialized use of microtopography. We have lots of evidence for pastoralism, which of course if you have, for all of you who have sheep, you know that you have to move around with them a lot. But the real indicators we have for this is we track every piece of building stone from our sites and we figure out where it all comes from. And it turns out that even the smallest, poorest sites are built with stones that come from as far away as 20 kilometers uphill. There's no way that they're going 20 kilometers just to pick up a couple stones. They're probably moving around for other reasons and collecting building stones in order eventually to construct their various buildings. All of which points to, I think, a far more physically mobile peasantry than that had been imagined in the historiography. I have to emphasize that these are very preliminary results. We've done this for 3 years. We've done 6 sites out of millions that could potentially be excavated. And I think the real question that we need to ask, and that you all should be asking of me, is how applicable is this data outside of our region? If I have to extend our conclusions to speak to the models, I think that there's a far greater spectrum of poverty, that it is not a monolith. This shouldn't be surprising to any of you who work on other historic periods. It's certainly true, I think, for the Roman period. Highly mobile populations, both in space and in time. Our sites are occupied for very, very short periods of time and then they go out of use. So you have a significant investment of labor to build these things and then they move on, which is very interesting. Intensive agriculture, an agriculture more emphasizing meat, I think, than people had thought, both in pastoralism and for traction, and a peasantry which is absolutely tied to a Roman market economy. I think the interesting question is, to what degree does this picture, which is itself a monolithic picture, and I'm claiming this is true for the Roman peasant, there has to be temporal variability in this. A lot of the evidence, the best evidence that we have is actually from the 5th century AD. How much of the picture I've just described to you is actually a late antique picture is a question that we have. And the real task for us as we move forward is to try to lay the evidence that we have for the quality of life of these poor 90%, against changes in the Roman macroeconomy. There are massive changes in Rome's consumer economy and its monetary economy. How does this map against it? Are they inverted? That is to say, when the Roman macroeconomy is booming, are these people more impoverished? Or do they go hand in hand? This is something that we'd like to know. And is generally interesting, I think, for those of you who are interested in well-being and empires. Ultimately, I think that what we found doesn't so much contradict the extant models as suggest different images of rural poverty altogether. And a book that I've found many synergies with the kinds of results that we're getting is a book called Portfolios of the Poor, which essentially tracks how modern people who live on $2 a day or less deploy what financial resources they have. And as it turns out, at least in the modern world, they deploy them in an extraordinary, varied, and sophisticated package of investments at a very, very small scale. This seems to parallel, in some ways, the heterogeneity and the spread of risk that we see with our Roman peasants who are engaged. I think they have fingers in lots and lots of pies. This is what produces the particular archaeological profile that we get. And this is a group of people who are very actively pushing against their environment. It's in some ways, I think, what Amartya Sen might characterize as capabilities. Certainly the mobility that we're seeing among these people speaks against a kind of frozen peasantry who cannot and are not engaging to maximize their potential, but rather the opposite. And so this is something that I am sort of thinking about. Ultimately, where we'd like to get is quite different than the paper that I gave to you. The paper I gave to you, as I said, was a kind of compare and contrast with extant historiography. I hope that this project will ultimately produce a very different kind of story that is more like a thick description of peasant life rather than a set of models. I think that this is what archaeology does best. It produces images from the ground and the peasant eye upwards that really allows one to see the detailed and thickness experience of daily life in a way that our texts for this period are never going to allow us to do. And so, as I hope if I were to come back here in 5 years' time and give this paper, it would be a completely different type of discussion that actually might be able to envision what a life or lives might actually be like. Thanks.
Over to you, Nate.
All right. I will use this podium. This was really a splendid paper, and very much in keeping with the extraordinarily innovative and really immensely important work that not only archaeologists are starting to do to contribute to the answers to these kinds of questions that historians have wanted to know the answers to for a long time, but also that really represent a kind of contribution to this sort of larger sort of picture of the Roman economy. This topic, this whole nature of the Roman economy, was really been the subject of debate since about 1972, really, when M.I. Finley gave his famous Sather lectures at Berkeley on the Roman economy and really sort of problematized it for scholars for the first time. These were published in '73. And in some ways, the basic question he was trying to get at was why the Roman economy did not take off. Clearly, there was a certain degree of material prosperity that you could see around there. But why didn't it reach the sort of critical mass that you see, say, in early modern England that contributes to the becoming of the Industrial Revolution? And Finley's answer was slaves. There was no need for sort of innovative labor-saving devices that and sort of efficiencies that were developed in the early modern period when you had an abundance of slave labor. So you could be as inefficient with your labor as possible because it was always possible to get more slaves. Now this has created an enormous debate that's not by any means over yet, particularly with the work of Keith Hopkins coming along in the later '70s, a kind of student of Finley's who brought a much greater sophistication methodologically. He was a sociologist by training to the whole debate. So now real questions of wealth in the Roman economy begin to be developed, and that leads obviously to the question of how this was distributed. Was it concentrated in the hands of a very small elite, or was it sort of widely distributed so that the quality of life of ordinary people was somewhat higher than abject poverty. So you have now, in a sense, these two sort of positions. An older position that, as Professor Bowles said, sees peasants as kind of mired in poverty, sort of eking out their subsistence for eternity, or small farmers, very entrepreneurial kinds of people, whose quality of life, at least as some scholars would argue, begins to approach that of ordinary people in early modern England, at least the more prosperous ones. Within this context of economy, demography obviously enters the debate. The sort of Malthusian hypothesis that the number of people has a direct bearing on the quality of life of those individuals is obviously of real relevance to trying to understand how the economy works, what the economy means for ordinary people in their day-to-day lives. And as those of us who study demography know, it's really about sex and death. And health and disease are obviously directly related to that latter question. So any demographer, anybody interested in the quality of life of ordinary people and the degree to which demographic factors affected that, has to come to grips somehow with the question of how the preventative check of disease impact population. So this question has, for the most part, in those cases where disease has really even been thought about by scholars, has really only been answered in very general terms, except for those cases where you have massive plagues like the Antonine plague or the Justinianic plague. But it's only, sort of how on a day-to-day level disease affects mortality has been only answered in very general terms because we just lack any sort of statistical basis or detailed evidence, as you get, for example, in early modern England or elsewhere, where you really get some sort of hard, detailed data that give you some sense of how people's lives are affected by disease and death. Now, this is where it seems to me archaeology, by sort of implication, can make a major contribution to move the discussion forward, to provide at least some more fine-grained, specific evidence about the lives of ordinary inhabitants in the ancient world, in particular times and places. Now, as Professor Bowles and all my archaeological colleagues will be the first to admit, archaeology has its own problems in terms of how to understand the evidence that they come up with. But it can provide a starting point for thinking about things like disease and health in Roman Italy. As I think Professor Bowles' paper very provocatively does. The first and most obvious for those of us who study disease, or think about disease in ancient Italy, the first thing that comes to mind is malaria. Malaria has been considered a huge factor in mortality. It certainly was in the early modern period, in the medieval period, and it's been argued by Solaris that it was a tremendous factor in mortality throughout central Italy. Not so much directly, malaria really kills its victims, but it weakens the immune systems so that people fall prey to other kinds of pathologies, either disease directly or gradual malnutrition, because malaria weakens you to the point where you can't work and so you simply go down the tubes. For that reason, the drains that one finds in these fields are highly significant, because these are not just sort of little drains that you might sort of clear out in your backyard. These are big drains, comparatively speaking. They represent a tremendous investment in time and labor. So, and even if these drains are primarily for agricultural purposes, the draining off of standing water throughout fields clearly has a direct relationship to the degree to which mosquitoes are able to breed and thrive in these areas. So the paper asks us to consider to what extent efforts like these, if they were replicated throughout central Italy, to what extent they would have impacted the degree to which malaria was a factor in the health and mortality of the people who lived in that area. Other suggestions, other findings of the excavation suggest a number of other points, particularly the pollen data pointing to pastoralism. This is quite surprising. We tend to think that peasants grew their crops. The sort of notion of the self-sufficient, subsistent peasant growing kind of whatever the family needs to survive is based on the assumption that these people are growing wheat, usually, or some combination of grain crops, because grain is the foundation of the diet of almost everybody in the ancient world. But it's difficult to imagine that peasants who are mired in poverty, sort of scratching out a living on the tiny little piece of land that they manage to work, are able to raise sheep, goat, say even cattle in pastoralism. Pastoralism, in some ways, is a much more advanced economic activity than simply growing wheat. Cato the Elder, in the 2nd century BC, was famously asked by some fellow what the best investment was, and his answer was good pasturing. The fellow asked what the second best investment was, and Cato said fairly good pasturing. As the third best investment, he said poor pasture. Finally, he said, well, what's the fourth best? Well, cultivating crops. And the guy says, well, what about lending money? And Cato said, well, what about killing a man? But the idea is that you make money pasturing. So this is not necessarily a subsistence strategy. This is a market strategy. It's an economic strategy that these guys could well be pursuing. The problem that we have, or the big question that looms over something like this, is the question of who owns the land and who owns the animals. In other words, are these small independent entrepreneurs, people who are raising a few sheep or goats and selling them at market some particular place, or are these people, or is everything owned by the job creators of antiquity, the wealthy people who have the capital to invest in these kinds of enterprises, both the land and the animals, and that the people who are actually doing the herding and living in these small places are slaves or hired hands. We really don't understand. We can't tell from the material remains who they are. But the implications for the health of the occupants can be profound, because the independent entrepreneurs, the small peasant proprietor, invested in an economic activity that generates an income, is likely to have a possibility of a much higher quality of life than hirelings or slaves who are able to earn or are sort of given the bare subsistence for life. So this is a critical question, and one that's unfortunately very difficult to answer by the material remains. But what, again, is also very exciting about this, the work that Professor Bowes and her colleagues have done is the market involvement. Again, it's been long assumed that you have peasants who are on the land, living a kind of subsistence existence with very little mobility, because they don't need to go anywhere. They simply raise their crops. They live and die within 4 or 5 miles of where they grow up. But the pastoralism, the grazing animals for market, the indications of storage capacities far beyond what a family would need, and the ceramics themselves, which clearly have to be purchased either through money or some sort of barter, clearly, and the other indications of mobility clearly demonstrate that there's tremendous the more involvement in the market and market exchange than anybody had imagined who subscribed to the old theories of immobile peasants. The movement of goods and people, therefore, raises the possibility of a significantly greater movement of germs than had appeared to have been suspected, at least among the ordinary people. Again, if you have static peasants living in tiny little areas who don't go very many places and don't have much involvement in the market, they're insulated from the kinds of morbidity that more mobile populations are capable of exposing themselves to. But again, we know that in the late 180s BC, for example, there was significant plague, not just in Rome or in the larger towns of Italy, where you expect endemic or epidemic disease to break out, but all throughout the rural areas, the small towns, the villages of central Italy. Plague was so devastating that periods of Thanksgiving were ordered by the Roman government, and the consuls of the years had trouble raising armies because there simply weren't enough able-bodied individuals able to present themselves. So this, again, suggests that the movement of goods and people throughout complex webs of exchange is a significant factor in the disease regime of rural Italy's, particularly if, as Professor Bose suggests, these peasants are commuting peasants. That is, they're living in villages where disease can spread much more easily than peasants living on isolated farms, distant from their neighbors. Now, again, all of this raises possibilities that have to remain speculative until more work in the field can be done, not only by Professor Bose and her colleagues, but hopefully lots of other people who are going to go out and do very much the same kind of work. But she's pointed the way to a new and very provocative understanding of health and disease in the ancient world. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. I want to open this up for questions. So, ask Kim and Nate some searching, provocative questions, please.
I'll ask a quick question. What would a slave quarters look like? In the American context, we know what they look like, and in the American South, we know what we hit them. But what's your speculation? What would slave quarters look like?
Well, we used to think we knew very clearly.
Yeah, we did.
I know, it was so nice when we thought we knew. There was a very famous excavation of a villa called Sette Finestre, and the guy who excavated it claimed to have found, and was actually quite convincing in his argument for having found a slave quarters, which interestingly, he also found a very large and elaborate pigsty. And the pigsty and the slave quarters actually look almost identical. In other words, it's a large courtyard with very, very small, identical rooms that look like little cells based around the courtyard. So you have this sort of, panopticon-like monitoring effect from the center of the courtyard. A new book has come out and said, actually, it's entirely possible that those slave quarters are horse stalls or pigsties, and that they aren't slave quarters at all, and that the archaeology for slave habitations is a lot shakier than we thought. So now we're, I think, wondering.
Well, it's a clear question of the theory driving the interpretation of the archaeological remains, because the rise of slave labor is very much tied into a broad narrative of why the Republic falls, which has to do with the importation of slave labor, the dispossession of small peasants from their plots, the impoverishment of those peasants, they're being drafted into the army, which become the forces that Caesar and Pompey lead against one another. So, in a sense, that whole narrative of peasant impoverishment and the rise of slave labor has essentially driven how archaeological remains are interpreted. So it's a case of the tail wagging the dog, essentially.
But you wouldn't expect to find 45 bronze coins and pottery that matches a local large town. And
So the issue that that Nate raised is how do we excavate who owns these things and who these people are is the question, and ultimately, unfortunately, it's the question that archaeology is very, very bad at dealing with. However, I would probably be almost comfortable saying it's unlikely these are slaves for two reasons. First is, if space can be used as a proxy for power, which is not always the case, we have one elite site in our whole area. And this site, for instance, is the farthest, is very far, right? It's 20 kilometers as the crow flies, and much farther if you actually had to travel it. So if these are slaves that are sort of an outpost of this villa, they're very, very distant and difficult to sort of manage and monitor. And this is late, right? And I think in general, we believe that slavery decreases as a force, and by the late empire, although now there's a new argument to the opposite, so I shouldn't say too much, and I haven't read that book, that's not always the case, but in any case, I think these are probably not slaves.
No.
Archaeologically though, there is no more a footprint of slavery at this point, I don't think, than there is a footprint of the poor domestic farmer. It would be difficult to distinguish them.
Yeah, slavery is a spectrum rather than a
Yes,
specific
that's right.
thing. So, you know, slaves were allowed to have a little savings, and one of the ways of controlling slaves and essentially incentivizing them, if you can use that word, to cooperate was by allowing them to accumulate a certain amount of money, because the idea was that you would get the slave to buy his own freedom. So it's, you know, it's very difficult to sort of use the coins as a proxy. The time period is, I think, a better indication, but again, you know, this is a very small sample in a very big empire, so it's hard to say, you know, what the rule is. This could be quite an unusual exception. We just don't know.
Also, in mortuary evidence, you don't really see that footprint either, which is interesting. You know, if you're looking for slaves in a mortuary context, you can't tell, especially when you're dealing with, you know, domestic slaves.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's right. And we don't have any mortuary evidence.
No.
No dead people.
Actually, where are the dead people? I mean, where are
This is a
the,
great question.
where are the bodies?
Yeah. We don't have any dead people, and we've had, we're now, after 3 years, realizing we really need some dead people. Because the questions of malaria, of disease, of morbidity and mortality, you heard, I guess, a couple weeks ago from a prehistorian who's working on this in the large scale, and those, I have to say, those studies frighten me, because at least as they've been done in Italy, they can be done on identical material and come to completely opposite conclusions in terms of health and mortality. And most of those studies have been done on urban populations. There's very little evidence from the rural world. If I had to guess where they are, Mari found none of them. She's the colleague who did the field survey that our project is based on. She found not one necropolis, which suggests they're in the places the field survey didn't hit, which are probably hilltops and forested areas, which makes a certain amount of sense for a variety of other reasons. So I think that's where it is, and we're going to start looking for them next year. We'll send students out. See if they come back.
On the topic of mobility, were you able to find roads and kind of linking things between the main villa site, I suppose, and sort of like peripheral settlements?
So I didn't discuss a big portion of our project, and I'll talk about in a minute why I didn't discuss it, which has been to try to actually map routeways based on the geological data. So that if we can assume that building stone from point X that wound up in point Y suggests that there may have been people who went from point X to point Y, we've used a combination of aerial photography, GIS, and ground truthing to try to actually figure out what those routeways might have been. And I keep telling part of the team that's doing this to not use the term roads. Because when you say Roman road, that implies a certain thing, which is not extant in this area, right? These are certainly sort of worn paths, which actually probably are seasonally not useful because they aren't metalled, so they get really muddy in the spring, et cetera, and they're subject to collapse and erosion, and therefore they move around to a certain extent. Then there's even more minor pathways. We're starting to get a sense of where those are. That being said, I'm not very confident in this part of the project, and they haven't sold it to me yet in a way that I actually buy. The thing about, for those of you who's ever used GIS, the answers that you get really depend on the way in which you basically, the way you set up the machine to ask the questions. And so the rootways, the rootways vary depending on how we've set up the GIS to track them. I do think that ultimately we will figure out where the major rootways were. And I think we have a sense of how people moved around this landscape. As I was talking to the graduate students earlier, this is a landscape which is bisected by lots of very, very deep, but very small little ravines that are seasonal streams. These are impossible to cross. They're impossible to cross in the winter because they're full of water, and they're impossible to cross in the summer because they're full of really nasty vegetation. And so it's a landscape in which if you want to even move short distances, you have to walk long distances. As it turns out, it actually doesn't take that much time to walk those long distances because we've actually gone out and done it. And so what looks on a map to be this enormously long route to go around these barriers turns out to be 45 minutes. That being said, what of course it forces you to do, or you elect to do if you don't build some sort of bridge across these things, is that it moves you through a whole different subset of landscapes. Instead of just moving from point A to point B, which is a very sort of modern way of thinking about movement, is that your path meanders you through a whole set of other kinds of potentially fields and human relationships as you move from point A to point B. It could be that the mobility that we're seeing is in part a product of this very particular landscape.
I wondered about upstreaming and downstreaming. In Native American work, we talk about, we have archaeological context, we have scraps of ethnographic data, and there's this highly questionable question of whether you can downstream information back onto the archaeological material. And I wondered, I mean, you talk about the poor bills, the poor 20th century, 21st century poor, using all sorts of complex ways of, but are there more, I mean, one, can you talk about medieval, early modern Italian peasantry as models for these people? I mean, how far distant, I mean, at what point in the medieval past can you say, oh, we're beginning to see a pattern that looks, some of the details may be different, but we're looking at very close to Roman patterns that you think you're seeing?
So our historian for the project has gotten sidetracked by all this mobility stuff and hasn't done his job, which is to do this. So I've been starting to do this. And it's an interesting question. The assumption, of course, is that the ethnographic data ought to be immediately useful. But that, of course, assumes an unchanging peasant. And so it's already problematic from that point of view. I think the reason that the medieval archaeology for this group of people is utterly different. And we actually excavated one of these medieval sites, which people also didn't think existed, last season. And they're completely different. They don't have the variability, they're cookie cutters. And you see the same cookie cutter thing everywhere. The health and mortality issues we can't compare because we don't yet have them.
Meaning they are living on their sites, they're not living in the village.
Well, most medieval settlement in this part of the world is entirely in villages. There's very, very little dispersed settlement. There is some which nobody thought existed, and we excavated one of these. And it interestingly shows far more investment in the physical structure of the house than any of our Roman sites. But what we have in the Roman period that we don't have for the medieval period is this enormous heterogeneity of different types of sites used for different types of things. So in the medieval period, everything looks pretty much the same. And there isn't this investment in the actual landscape itself, so that you have commuting peasants, but they aren't building these things in the landscape. I think the big difference, though, is the Roman market economy and the Roman consumer good economy, which, at least in Italy, doesn't exist in the Middle Ages until the very later Middle Ages. And that, I would argue very tentatively, is fundamentally shaping the way in which these peoples are both managing their landscape and their quality of life and well-being. And that's what you don't have in the early Middle Ages. And that's what you don't have, really, until probably the 13th century. So that's where I would say, I would be very worried about making the comparison, because that's the big thing that's changed.
Okay, well, that's the question.
But that's the question.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's also potentially a political dimension as well, in that during the Republic, you have a competitive aristocracy, and you can argue that the ability of powerful individuals to cream off surplus from peasants through various socio-political mechanisms of control is much more limited than when you get a monarchy and peasant political and social power declines, and making it possible for landlords to simply begin accumulating larger and larger tracts of land, and using the peasants as kind of exploitable labor, so that their surplus basically goes to enrich a member of the elite rather than being consumed by themselves. So potentially, it's when you get into the medieval period that you get, this kind of oppressive social regime, whereas much earlier, potentially, they're much more, the wealth is controlled more by the producers than some landlord. So so that makes the medieval situation very difficult to compare to an early period. But again, this is largely speculative.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's been lots of work done on these questions for the later Middle Ages. So at least archaeologically, so that you can compare apples with eventually you'll be able to compare apples with apples.
Well, let me ask you, sorry. Oh.
You go.
Okay, this was kind of on this question about the relationship between the early Middle Ages and the early medieval peasant and these guys. I was really struck by the Piavina site and the idea that there are these, relatively prosperous peasants. And there's an historian, very famous early medievalist named Chris Wickham, who wrote this book called Framing the Middle Ages, where he posits this quite radical, this sort of rupture and he's a Marxist historian, so he likes ruptures, and that there is this moment, he times it with the end of the late Roman fiscal structures, that you have this kind of surgence of the peasant, and you have this kind of widespread peasant prosperity that I think again argue ends shortly thereafter. Is there a rupture? Is this apples and oranges? Because you really are talking about a totally different issue because of the connection to the physical structure or lack thereof? Or is he actually seeing just a kind of a sort of proliferation of what you can actually see in late antiquity? In other words, there's more continuity with late antiquity than he allows.
That's a good question.
I know you have one site, so I
Yeah.
realize I'm asking you to massively extrapolate.
And what we don't understand yet is, this isn't the only site in our region that has this moment, this rich, small, right, but relatively consumer-rich early 5th century moment. And we don't understand what's going on in the 5th century, the early 5th century, that allows this to happen. And it's not just in our place, that this is true of lots of places around Italy that happens. And I think nobody understands this, right? And so you'd have to understand why this happens first. There's a rupture, and then everything vanishes right after this. So we have nothing from the later part of the 5th century, and we certainly have nothing from the 6th century. We don't have anything from the 7th.
Okay. Wow.
Well, just poof, gone.
Nothing.
And where do they go? What happened?
Well, this is the big question in Italian archaeology, because we can't find the pots, we can't find the people. There have been increasingly more successful attempts to find the people, and one argument is they go uphill. And they live in fortified villages that actually have medieval fortified villages built on top of them, so they're hard to, you can't find them in field survey, you actually have to dig. And this is probably not a bad argument. The problem is still the chronologies, because we don't know how to recognize the pots. We have a very difficult time finding them. And there's still a problem with the 8th century. There's just nothing. So, I mean, I hate to agree with the Marxists, but there's definitely some kind of rupture. And so I don't see this. So Chris Wickham posits this happy peasant who doesn't pay any taxes. And interestingly, when he tries to, he doesn't talk a lot about quality of life, right? He's not interested in these kinds of measurements. And when he does, he calls on some really suspect skeletal data, which has been contradicted in other identical skeletal studies, which show that these people are no better or no worse in terms of their morbidity and mortality than those who came before or after. I mean, it's difficult to actually talk about peasant quality of life when you have not any evidence. And he has even less evidence than we have.
I'm curious, since Rome is famous for its laws, that were laws not created regarding the use of the land and mobility and so on in regard to the peasantry?
This is a particularly interesting case for late antiquity, in which there seem to be lots of laws restricting the mobility of tenants, who, and these laws were traditionally read as tying tenants to their land. And I think we've now realized that this is not what these laws are about at all. That these are laws that are actually as much about making sure who is responsible for paying the taxes on a certain piece of land, because the tax structure changes, and it's no longer just based on your head, it's based on a place. And so that every place has to have someone responsible for coughing up the dough for that place. And so these laws that seem to be immobilizing the peasantry, there's been a whole new body of scholarship that says actually that's not really what they're about at all. And there is, if you read the text lately on their head, you see people moving around a lot. So that's the most sort of coherent body of stuff in which people are actually being restricted in terms of mobility. And this is exactly the period of these people, these peasantry people.
You know, I guess just to extend this, since I tend towards a Marxian point of view, and you look for power and where's the money, you would think that people in the cities and the centers would want to make sure they're getting the taxes, like you're saying, out of here, and so that the laws would affect how the land is being used. That the laws are defined or created in many ways to control these people. And if there's a lack of law, that means there's a lack of interest here, and there's not enough of an economic basis to bother with. Which goes back to the question of their participation in markets.
Well, Roman law, and all of you people who work on Roman law should jump in here, but I mean, Roman laws are as much written, they are certainly written to control people, but they're also rhetorical statements written to describe a reality that doesn't actually exist.
As an old.
Yes. Which is why we've become suspect in using them, in reading them in a sort of literalist way, because this clearly, they weren't being, and of course, there's the enforcement issue. And as empires go, Rome was very, very thinly policed. So its laws are one thing, and the actual applicability of those laws are another. This is, I think, where we actually get to the potential weirdness of our study area. We are liminal, right? So that if power is diluted through distance, and you can argue with that as a precept, we are far away from points of power. Right? We have one villa, we're a day and a half walk from the nearest city. If control is diluted, it's diluted in places, diluted, not diluted, I think in places like this. And so if you imagine a spectrum, rather than there is power and there is control and it's a kind of monolith, right, and there's a spectrum of the ability to actually to do what one wants to do in terms of control, I think this is at the edges. And so I'm not saying that all those coins aren't going to be used to pay taxes. They may, I mean, that's exactly what they might be doing. And of course, these people, we can show, have very tight connections with the city, at least in terms of trade connections, which imply a whole set of associated connections. So I don't have any problem with them being oppressed by urban elites. I would say that their oppression by urban elites is not preventing them from engaging in a whole set of other kind of relationships, which actually may be, so this is the opposite of the happy peasant argument. The opposite argument is that taxation actually leads to increased production and increased contact with markets and a whole set of, sort of follow-on effects which can't be anticipated or controlled by the people who are engaged in the oppression game. So I think that might be a better characterization of how I see these guys anyway.
Right.
You have to choose.
Great.
Well,
Maybe I should
this is
go.
probably an absolutely impossible question to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Peasant subjectivity, is it possible you can make any sort of advance towards that very elusive area there? I'm just thinking when we're talking about quality of life markers, indicators, general vitality, I mean, it does obviously matter quite a bit how they saw themselves, whether they thought of themselves as poor and benighted and living out a wretched existence, all 90% of them. I mean, at some level, if it is 90%, then that's normal, and do we really expect any better? And I think there's also, in our world, a tendency probably to look at a little house like that and think, God, I couldn't live in a place like that, and 4 meters by 4 meters. And yet we should remember, these people aren't dealing with the world as individuals, they're dealing presumably as parts of families that have been in this area for generations, households, parts of wider neighborhoods, perhaps even if they are somewhat more mobile, as you said. And then there's the larger world of the town beyond, and then ultimately Mother Rome. They're all connected, and there's probably a sense of interdependency among them at some level, much more than there would be in, say, Jacksonian Nebraska or something. I'm just wondering along those lines, if I realise it's very hard to trace these kinds of things archaeologically, but is it possible that there might be a kind of that you could recover some intimations of peasant subjectivity from what you've worked on?
So that actually, I know that, I mean, it does sound like it's kind of impossible. That ultimately is where we would like to get, and certainly members of our project are really interested in this question. I personally think that the mobility issue is the best avenue into that question. And so I don't have an answer. I have a set of ways I might go about asking those questions, or sort of observations. The first is that you're dealing with a group of people whose, and Nate, you were talking about this, whose set of connections, whose human contact is far more variegated, I think, both in time and in space than we had previously thought. So these are not people who live in a vacuum, right? In other words, I would expect very much that these people have profoundly opinionated opinions about lots of different things, particularly about things like city-country, about urban elites. Who may know that based on experience? I think that the commuting issue and the fact that you have people who both simultaneously live in what must have been, okay, if I have to guess, I guess we're going to find quite spatially compacted spaces, right? Which we have some sense of from texts in completely another part of the empire, are really antagonistic places, right? This is not the villagers that all hang together. These are the villagers that all want to kill each other, right? That you know, because everyone can see everyone else and no one's business is private, yada yada. At the same time, every day you go out and you're in your own space, which is really interesting, right? So that you actually have, this is not like Montagu, right? It's the kind of bifurcated existence of the solitary, you know, sort of Cincinnatus type farmer and the, you know, claustrophobic villager. That must produce really interesting sets of experiences. Likewise, the contact, probably more frequent than we thought, with an urban setting.
And also there's the olive presses and things like that, which seem to be held in common, as you suggested. Further source of sociality, I suppose.
And yet, you know, that site is really interesting because it sits on a hill that has a 360-degree view. And we kept asking, why the hell would they put this thing as a pain in the ass to walk up? It's really steep, yada yada, but you can see it from everywhere. In other words, you can monitor it, right? So it both allows you to see out, but also allows, if it's a collective use site, that suggests further to that slight, you know, one does not trust one's neighbors.
There were a bunch of other hands up, so over here.
One way you can prevent a Malthusian famine outcome would be to some kind of systematic population control, such as abstinence or contraception or abortion or infanticide. Was something like that practiced, or
I'll let Nate answer that one.
you have no idea?
Who knows? I mean, you know, it's controversial. There's no evidence really of infanticide. Abortion, well, it's pretty clear that there's no common, given what we can reconstruct about births. It's a pre-transitional fertility regime, so there's no indication that there are artificial methods of controlling reproduction. As far as disease is concerned, well, that's the $64 question. I mean, if there are massive sort of waves of plague that sweep through and keep the population down, that's one thing I argued, that mortality in war is very high during the period when Rome is constantly fighting wars. But so in that sense, possibly the sort of Augustan peace is a demographic disaster. If warfare is a kind of preventive check, then once you remove that, then the population increases. But who knows, really?
There was a herbal contraceptive, wasn't it? At least the elite may have used, but or didn't it work? Or
No, if the elite used anything, it was slaves.
It was
The elite didn't want, the elite wanted only a limited number of children, or none, if they could have them, but the men had sexual drives and they had access to slaves. And so that's undoubtedly how they prevented legitimate children from being born beyond the number that they wanted. As far as herbal, again, we can only look at this through indications of birth rates, which we have some indication of from Egypt. So you can, there's a pre-transitional birth rate curve, and there's a post-transitional birth rate curve where you start with women when they become fertile in their late teens, and post-transitional you see no matter how many children are born per woman, at a certain point it drops off very sharply before menopause. Right? So the curve basically goes along and then it drops down. Pre-transitional, where there is no artificial contraception, women continually have children. No matter how many they have, the curve simply is much smoother. It doesn't drop off suddenly at a certain number for a large population. So women have children until basically they are no longer capable physically of having children. So there's and the evidence that we have from the ancient world clearly suggests that it's a pre-transitional fertility regime, which again suggests there's no indication of widespread use of any kind of artificial contraception or abortifacient. That's the best we can do. Was there some magic herb? Well, maybe in a few cases, but as a common practice, there's no evidence for it.
And I would add to this that there's been a lot of discussion on infanticide. I think too much, actually. And in part, for reasons that have nothing to do with the ancient world. They have to do with our own sort of horror at this practice. And many, well not many, but there's been a very vocal crowd of people who've said, this points to extreme poverty, because why else would you expose your children, and that this was a major control on population. I find this completely unconvincing, because the sources that talk about infanticide do so because it's a highly charged issue in the ancient world as well, and infanticide is good to think with for a whole variety of reasons. So these are not sources that can be used to reliably say that this is common practice. If anything, I think they may actually suggest the opposite, in that there's an urban elite that finds it appalling, as a moment in which you choose to not raise a child and actually toss them out on the rubbish heap. This is an extraordinarily charged issue. That's why they talk about it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's convincing.
Well, there's also Harris's claim, and others who claim that rather than infanticide, what you have is the exposure of children who become slaves. So in other words, you leave the unwanted child, the unwanted infant on the temple steps, and some fellow or woman comes along and says, okay, I'll raise this child, and he or she becomes a slave. So and it becomes a major source of slaves at a time when the great slave hauls from war are declining significantly. So this is how they keep up the numbers of slaves, because slaves, at least the theory is, are not reproducing as a free population would reproduce. That's at least one argument, which would suggest that you don't have much infanticide, because those infants are actually raised and contribute to the population. They contribute, however, to the unfree population rather than the free population.
Fritz, you had your hand up a while ago. Fritz? Yes, it's all right, don't worry.
You said a while ago, your area is very marginal out of a lot of things. Do you expect, therefore, not to find, do you not to plan to find, so to speak, let's say, full kind of exchange? I'm thinking of a passage in Pliny where he talks about a tiny sanctuary on one of his estates. Sanctuary sort of squeezed in between a road and a ravine, which he sort of has to extend because it's once a year there's a fair, and then all the peasants come and exchange stuff and sort of interact, make treaties and so on and so forth. So my question is, do you think something like that will come up in your area at one point, and how would that look on the ground?
So, right, periodic markets are, this is another thing that Romanists are very interested in, is the periodic market. And periodic market associated with temples, which I was very interested in as well, so I know that passage. What's interesting about Pievina is that the ceramic profiles are so similar to Roselle, which is the nearest town, that it looks as though there's no intermediary. So that the periodic market, the rural periodic market, or the village as exchange point don't look like options. Instead, and this is what, you can't see it too well in this because I've made it too small. And someone pointed out to me that this person looks like they're petting a dog. But this is supposed to be the traveling ceramic merchant coming with their ARS, their African red slipware, and the peasants are actually going down to look at the wares. The idea that, so we think very carefully about how we do these reconstructions, is that in this case, right, the city is coming to the country, but it could be the other way around, in which these people go to the city, but you can't draw that, obviously. So that, at least as far as this site's concerned, not that scenario, which is really interesting, because the people who've thought most about peasant exchange have really pushed hard on the periodic market, the fair, and the village as intermediary points of exchange, and the vicus, which is a sort of hybrid, very big village that is common in some parts of the Roman world. So far, not the case here, like one-on-one. But we're going to dig a village next year, so I'll come back and tell you. We still don't have any shrines, though, likely shrines. But I think from surface survey, they would be indistinguishable from other sorts of things. So we would actually have to dig one in order to know if we had a shrine or not. It's interesting, though, in the medieval period, there are some markets whose archaeological profile is simply a whole ton of coins. And that's it, right? There's no buildings, there's no nothing. Because the sort of physical structure of the market itself is so transient that you find nothing other than the mode of exchange, and that's it, which is kind of cool. Anyway, we haven't found that either.
What's the closest sea to Pievina? I mean, what would have been in the 5th century?
Roselle.
Roselle. That had a bishop.
Yeah, it did. It had a pretty early bishop, too.
Interesting. I mean, one of the things that this makes me think about as someone who works on the relationship between religion and the institution of religion and sort of people in general, is, you know, there's often claims in, for example, I'm thinking of Caesareus of Arles speeches, and he's talking to peasants. And I'm always like, no, he's not talking to peasants. He's talking to the other wealthy people inside of Arles, and he's casting this in terms of Rusicitatas because it's a tapas, but maybe it's not.
Yeah.
Maybe he's talking to peasants, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is actually making me rethink that assumption, and so that's going to, I mean, for those of us who work on some of this homiletic material, if we have to start thinking about mobility on totally different levels than I think we are accustomed to thinking about.
Yeah, and I think actually, I mean, in general, I mean, if the mobility idea is right, and I'm right in thinking about a lived experience that involves periodic presence in cities, that you actually have to imagine your urban demographic differently.
Yeah.
Right? That your urban demographic is very much composed of these rural people who show up quite a lot and probably associated with certain kinds of festivals and markets, and then leave. And this goes to your point, Nate, about germs.
Well, I mean, it's urban, do we have to sort of do to urban and rural what we've done to public and private?
Yeah, no,
Which
this
is just, they're relational, they're not oppositional,
Yep.
and just totally rethink those categories.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. These questions do point up, though, that we have no dead people and we have no God. So we have found no evidence for, yet for sort of ritual lives, which is a real bummer.
Were these Christians?
Sorry?
Were they practicing Christians or?
We have a church that's built into the villa, but since none of this has been excavated, we only have vague dates, and so we don't know. By the 5th century, who knows? Could go either way.
But you know, of course, large scale that a simple sanctuary might simply not look very distinctive. If you don't have a guy like Pliny to pay for a couple of marble cones to set them in front, there's nothing except a rectangular thing, and the altar might be a couple of sods that actually disappeared by now.
Yep. You know, Joe Carter has dug some of these in Metaponto, which you may know about, and they're really small. They do have a distinctive material profile because they are these points of votive offerings. And maybe those votives are, you know, coins, or maybe, in other words, they may not take the form of votives like little sculptures or things like that.
It could be cakes, it could be something that goes away, right?
Yeah, let's not think about that. The nice thing about digging at this sort of extraordinarily low level of material culture is that you become, very sensitive to what you do have. And we now have things to compare it with. And I feel kind of confident that if we found a shrine, we'd know it was. Which we wouldn't have done 3 years ago.
Okay.
We would have had no idea.
More questions?
Well,
I do think spirituality, maybe, I don't know if religion or spirituality is what we want to call it, deserves a place at the table, and I hope it does. I hope we have enough kind of information about whatever the spirituality is. But movement, because I'm trying to forge some meaning, some cosmological meaning out of this mobility still. Is there kind of a spiritual power resting in the landscape, which would make mobility a spiritual experience of some kind? So I think indigenous studies, these peasants are kind of sounding indigenous in some ways. Travel is kind of a form of power, and moving away from where you're sitting is getting farther away from what's normal, farther into kind of a spiritual experience. And so that would kind of cast some cosmological meaning on this mobility.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because what I think I'm suggesting is that mobility is normal. Now, is all mobility normal? No, right? Because we're dealing with a whole range of mobilities, which have, we were talking about this before, right? There's a temporal quality to them. And some of them are certainly extraordinary, right? And they, especially if graveyards and shrines are not in villages, but they're in other places, which I would be willing to bet that they are, that there's a range of movement which is about deliberate distancing from the normal, and therefore has a sort of ritual component to it. The question is, though, to what degree is or was that separatable from other kinds of movement? In other words, was that simply an act of deliberate agency in which I am now going to the following place, and therefore this is a different kind of movement, versus, well, I'm going to do the kinds of removal from my daily scene that I do every day, which therefore makes them daily. If you see what I mean? Do you see? I mean, if you hypothesize constant toing and froing as part of daily experience, you have a problem with your quotidian versus your non-quotidian, if you see what I mean.
Right.
So until we can actually find these places, I can't answer this. But if I had to guess, I would guess that there is a component of what you're talking about. What I would want, but the devil is in the details, right? It's in distinguishing the nature of that kind of movement from the sort of hyperkinetic movement that seems to be characteristic of these people all the time.
Yeah, and I wonder if early Christianity has a role, because I think these models, these anthropological models of travel and spirituality would suggest that it's not just across the landscape travel, as a spiritual experience, but also kind of spherical, moving into the sky or down. And if Christian movement after death vertically would have.
Catherine Chin, for this thing I was just at, is working on this project that involves Palladius. And she's trying to talk about how Palladius was a late antique agronomist. And she's trying to sort of talk about how his discussions of sort of agricultural ritual links up to ideas about cosmological power and position. So now Palladius is no peasant. So I mean, gets us back to the problem. Like we have all these cool elite sources that tell us funky things, but to what extent does that map remotely onto how these people understood their landscapes? But it's interesting, and it is something to kind of when you get to the point to start trying to reintegrate the texts. And Palladius certainly had experience of the sort of peasant life to some extent. So anyway, that might be something to start thinking about.
No, it's true. And this idea of the vertical, right, is not exclusively Christian, because there's a long tradition of this kind of movement in traditional Greco-Roman religion, which is both associated with the dead and associated with various types of shrines, healing shrines, et cetera. So what will be interesting to see is the one graveyard we know exists is late antique, early medieval, and it's in the villa, or next to the villa. That is to say, it's not on an elevated site. It's at a lowland site. Who's buried there, we don't know, because we haven't dug it yet. Someone is going to dig it next year, and we're going to get to study the materials, so then we'll know.
Do we have time for maybe one more question? If someone's got.
Carol has a question.
Carol.
Actually, a completely different turn. I'm interested in your evidence for pastoralism and how that, whether you can tell me how that relates to agricultural use of the land, whether you think these are interconnected, whether you have a sense of the proportions of these, and is that part of the mobility that you're seeing?
Yes, so obviously pastoralism equals mobility by definition. And I think the evidence that we have so far suggests that they have to be doing both intensive arable agriculture and pastoralism. And this is, I was just talking about the graduate students earlier today, I think too often in Roman agricultural history, these are presented as either ors. And there's always this sort of teleology, right, that you have, in the beginning you have intensive agriculture and everyone was working really hard, and then slave villas came in and we all gave up and started growing sheep. This is obviously goofy. And so the binary doesn't work, that you have to be doing both. And actually, intensive pastoralism is probably what we're looking at. And if you read someone like Columella, he insists that you drain your sheep pastures. Because, you don't want your sheep to get, they get these worms when they, graze on, I don't understand sheep worms. But anyway, right, it's not good for sheep, and it's not good for malaria. So that there's a specific Latin word, right, for cultivated pasture. Not cultivated, but it's maintained pasture, right, improved pasture, yeah, thank you. So you're definitely doing both. I think my question would be, the degree to which I think we also tend to imagine that land that is pasture is always pasture, and land that is arable is always arable. And this is probably not true either, because actually the best thing you can do with your arable land is to put your sheep there and graze the stubble, because then they produce manure which fertilizes the fields. And the agronomists talk about this, and they talk about if you have enough sheep or cow, definitely do this. But don't do it at this time of year, because then you'll wreck your fields. And of course, everyone always assumes that this somehow applies to some unnamed percentage of the population, but not these people. But I think it's probably the case that these are going on simultaneously. And there's a guy who works on prehistoric Greek stuff, Paul Halstead, who's made exactly this claim, right? He says that animals are really important, but they're not important in a separatable way, that it's entirely an integrated system.
Well, on that notes, I think that the peasant is well and truly in question. Thank you so much.